Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 11th chapter in the book of John, and we're going to try and make it at least all the way up to the 27th verse. We try and say as much as possible in as little as time as possible, but if we do have time for leftover, we'll try and take it at least into the second stage of the chapter. But in the first division of the chapter, which marks the 27th verse, we read of the fifth I am statement that the Savior made. These are somewhat define the trajectory of the Gospel of John. So in the 6th chapter, the 35th and 48th verse, we read that he refers to himself as the bread of life. And in the 8th chapter, 12th verse, and the 9th chapter, 5th verse, we read of him referring to himself as the light of the world. And then in the 10th chapter and the 7th verse, we read of him as the door to the sheep. And in the 11th and 14th verse of the same chapter, we read that he is the good shepherd. So this is actually the fifth such I am statement. I may have said 4 earlier, but we left off at the declaration of him being the good shepherd. Now towards the tail end of the 10th chapter, we find him making statements with which his Pharisaical antagonist in the audience interpreted it as borderline blasphemous, and he set himself at great risk, so much so that he was violently hounded out of Jerusalem and retreated to the shore of the Jordan River. And then he's approached by a messenger from Mary and Martha, the two most beloved sister in his mortal ministry. And so the opening verse reads, "And a certain one was sick, Lazarus, from Bethania, in the village of Miriam, and her sister Martha." So Lazarus was the brother. We don't read much of him outside of this chapter at all, but he was related by blood to the two most precious females in Yahshua's ministry. "Now it was Mary who anointed the Master with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick." So John is writing this statement with the gift of hindsight, because in the 13th chapter we read of the before the Last Supper, she anointed him appropriately and generously, and she was commended for this, while Judas the traitor, being a covetous one and economically minded, said, why don't we feed the poor with the money that she has used to endow thy feet? And the Master's answer successfully silences the question that his time is near, but the poor will always be among us. "Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Master, see, he whom you love is sick. But when Yahshua heard, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the esteem of Elohim, so that the Son of Elohim might be esteemed by it." So this death was guided by destiny and designed towards wise and good design, which was to give Yahshua, who was the fullest revelation of Elohim, to give a manifestation of his power to substantiate the claims with which he had previously been driven out of Jerusalem from. And so the village that he's in is Bethania, which we might imagine in the first verse we read that would have been somewhat closer to the center of the nucleus of Judea, but we personally, do not know precisely where it lay. "Now Yahshua loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus." So love defines all that he is and all that he does. It is one of his many manifold attributes, and perhaps the one which is the greatest source of pleasure for any of his children. And we read that love, that all-encompassing love, was extended fully on these 3 siblings, to whom he knew personally and ministered to. He had driven out the demons of Mary and gently rebuked Martha. In the close of Luke's 10th chapter, we read of the division of labor and service ministry which existed between those two, but that's ultimately a side discussion. And now he's ministering to Lazarus in the hour of his greatest need, so much so that he doesn't even know it's not even his hour of greatest need, because he's dead. We don't learn that yet, but the master tells the messengers who are sent to convey the message of the two sisters is not to be interpreted as when this sickness is not unto death, but for the esteem of Elohim. So he would die temporarily, but he would be resurrected to show that the power of the resurrection resides in him, and wherever God is, so too lie his resurrecting powers. Therefore, when he heard that he was sick, then indeed he stayed at the place where he was 2 more days. So he could have attended to the urgency immediately. The death is not yet inferred from any of the antecedent passages. We read that he was sick, but not dead yet. So the master wasn't prompted by the urgency of the situation to stop what he was doing for the period of 2 days, because it was in that 2 days, because the Jews were superstitious people who created applied a lot of artificial righteousness from numerology, and there's something to do with the equation 3 that honestly I feel is not relevant to what I should be communicating, in any case off the track. The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews now are seeking to stone you, and you are going back there?" So he's reminding them of what he had just escaped. The murderously motivated antagonist in the previous chapter had compelled him to leave Jerusalem, lest they fall the fate that had marked their history of being prophet killers, and worse in this situation. Yahshua answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of the world." Now, the light of the world, he explains more fully in the 8th and 9th chapter. That's a separate discussion. We might do one on that soon. But the point we can deduce, at least minimally, from this passage is that the light is a compass and a guide which guides us on the where we need to walk on the straight and narrow. But the darkness is wider, vaster, more all-encompassing, and more deceptive and closer to sin. But that's just one of in the sense that this translation translated, it's a uppercase L, which indicates a claim to divinity. He said to this, and after that he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am not going there to wake him up." So he would eventually, but he was telling them that the time was not yet ripe. He had a wise purpose and design in mind, and he uses the apostles as an audience, and as well as the surrounding audience, to impart a lesson about who he was and what he could do. Therefore the disciples said to him, "Master, if he has fallen asleep, he shall recover." So they're making an ultimately presumptuous statement without the gift of hindsight or foresight, but they ended up being correct in any case. So fallen asleep is translated as death, and we read this in a few passages, such as 1 Thessalonians 4:13, 14, or somewhere. Both are in between. And so that means that they knew he was dead, but they knew that his power, the one who they were walking with, had the power to rise him up from the dead with simply a touch of the hand and a wish of the will. But Yahshua had spoken about his death, whereas they thought that he spoke of taking rest in sleep. So there was a confusion on this, even though throughout the New Testament there are some places where sleep translates as dead, but for whatever reason that was not the currency of contemporaneous Jewry. So then Yahshua said to them plainly, "Lazarus has died." So he closes the mystery and settles the case. He's already dead, and that makes it necessary for him to return to, because after being 3 days, the Jews, as I earlier mentioned, their numerology, 3 was the day in which a person could still be rescued from the dead. And for the sake I am glad I was not there, in order for you to believe. But let us go to him. So the entire purpose is revealed as a faith-building exercise, and so he let his good friend perish unto death in order to bring him back to life, and therefore demonstrate a more majestic element of his powers and attributes than he could have if he simply went there to rescue him while he was still living. Thomas, who is called the twin, then said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, so that we die with him." Now, Thomas is one of the figures from the New Testament who I feel gets a bum rap on account of the unfortunate appellation which has attached himself to his name. He is known as Doubting Thomas for his failure to believe in the absence of visible evidence and tangible touch, the fact of the resurrection that was unanimously affirmed by all the other 11 apostles and several other sources, but he was, at that moment in time, he was walking by sight, not by faith. Here we read that, and this is an unfortunately underlooked passage, because Thomas is one of those figures who's seldomly mentioned outside of in tandem, or in the infamous passage of the 20th chapter of this verse, tandem with the other disciples and the 12. But here we read that he was a doer, so he had a very action-oriented faith, and we shouldn't judge and malign a man's memory for a single lapse in the faith. It's easy to do so from the outside looking in the scriptures, but from the comfortable distance of abstraction, knowing human nature, we know that that could happen to any of us. So we shouldn't, we do him and ourselves a disservice by not examining the limited range of his ministry, which is revealed in the Gospels. According to legend, he did evangelize India and died a martyr there, so that is a substantial accomplishment. So just to remind you that the scriptures are not an exhaustive historical document. They are a theological document which contains historically necessary information selected at the authorized source of selection, but there's not everything that there is possible to tell about all these men and all their lives, and all these women too. Therefore, when Yahshua arrived, he found that he had already been 4 days in the tomb. So he had exceeded the length of time with which the Jews thought possible for one to still be living and dead. They had a limbo stage of a period of 3 days during which one was dead but not fully, but neither were they alive anymore. Now Bethania was near Jerusalem, about 15 stadions away. So I earlier mentioned I had a correct premonition that Bethania was located somewhat nearer to the nucleus of Judea, which would have been at Jerusalem. And here we read they are 15. We're not privy to the exact measurement, but that is certainly something one can look up if so inclined. But in any case, they were certainly closer than they were when the chapter started and the previous chapter ended, with them beyond the Jordan River in some mysterious unidentified location. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. This was a customary activity and one of neighborly duty and friendly service to join the mourners in the midst of their mourns, because the Jews had a strong, tight-knit sense of community, according to which they would enter into the deaths by observing them and joining in the mourning of their neighbors. Martha then, when she heard that Yahshua was coming, met him, but Mary was standing in the house. Martha then said to Yahshua, "Master, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." So she's tragically looking in the past. She's living in an alternate reality that just can never come into being quite again. So that is a misguided notion, but one entirely understandable with the minimal amount of empathy paid to someone who had just lost a beloved sibling. But even now I know that whatever you might ask of Elohim, Elohim shall give you. So she has faith in the connectedness of the master and his father, and so anything that he really wants is never more than a wish away because their wills are identical. But according to the functionally subordinate position of the son, he, as a formality, he always solicits the father in prayer to ask if for permission to do what he wants to do. But even now, I know Yahshua said to her, your brother shall rise again. So this is a future promise, and a marvelous one at that. When it becomes a manifestation, it is something spectacular and monumental to behold. But sadly, as we read in the next verse, Martha is still looking backwards. Martha said to him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection of the last day. So she had faith in the cardinal Orthodox Jewish doctrine of the resurrection, whereby souls and bodies were united in the afterlife for an eternity. For the some thought it was every child of Abraham, others thought it was a remnant of those within. Yahshua said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he dies, he shall live. So this is the fifth I statement, and it is one of the ones which combines something with life. So in the earliest one, when he's the bread of life, and then we read in this one that he's the resurrection and the life. And in the 14th chapter and 6th verse, we read that he's the way, the truth, and the life. So the life aspect is very much embedded in a little less than half of these 7 I am declarations. And also the belief in the resurrection transcends any fear of death, because we know that a more eternal afterlife awaits us. So this life is a preparatory school and a purgatory of sorts, according to which how we perform and answer at the judgment will determine our eternal destiny. But those who have faith in the resurrection and knowledge that they meet the repentant requirements, it is a source of joy and not of fear. And everyone that is living and believing in me shall never die at all. Do you believe this? So life is but the beginning of a more endless afterlife for those who abide in and die in and live in the Messiah. So he wasn't denouncing or dismantling the concept of the resurrection as traditionally understood by the Jewish contemporaries as a future event. He is trying to tell her something marvelous, that the present manifestation is very much in her midst and at work on her behalf. She said to him, Yes, Master, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of Elohim, who has come into the world. So from that foundational faith, she is able to lay hold of the greater faith through which miracles can happen and take place. And miracles do happen every day. They are not normally as spectacular as the dramatic events described in the Bible, but they are often more subtle miracles. And just to close the discourse, we're going to offer our definition of a miracle, which we define as an event or experience which defies, transcends, or supersedes the operation of ordinary natural laws. So that lays a rather broad brush through which one can determine and qualify a miracle. But that's all the time we have for today. Stay tuned till next time. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.